The dispatcher heard it before she even registered the caller's voice. A faint echo slipped through the line, her own question, already coming back wrong. 911, what's your emergency? She froze, because she hadn't finished saying it yet. A second later, the real caller came through, breathing hard, like he had been running through rooms that kept changing shape. Don't hang up, please don't hang up. Sir, she replied quickly, forcing control back into her voice. I need your location. A pause. Not empty. Occupied. Then his voice dropped lower, like something closer to him had just shifted its attention. It already knows I picked up. The dispatcher straightened, eyes locking onto the waveform on her screen. It wasn't normal anymore. Parts of the audio were repeating in perfect loops. Her voice, his breathing, or even the silence between words, like the call was trying to teach itself how to continue without them. A soft click came through the line. Not from her end, from his. And in that exact moment, the caller whispered something that made the entire room feel suddenly too quiet. It answered me before you did. The dispatcher didn't respond immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the incoming feed, where multiple 911 calls were now stacking in near-perfect alignment. Different callers, different voices, same sentence. A voice repeating inside the house. At first, it looked like panic clustering, something she had seen before when fear spread through a neighborhood faster than facts could be confirmed. But this was different, because it wasn't just repetition of idea. It was repetition of structure. And every caller arrived at the exact same phrasing, in the exact same order, regardless of how they started their sentence. The supervisor stepped closer, watching the screen with a slow shift in expression. These aren't independent reports, he said quietly. The dispatcher didn't look away. I know. Another call came in. Same pattern, same phrasing, same final line. A voice repeating inside the house. She glanced at the timestamp column again, all clustered, all within minutes. All converging on the same description, as if the incident itself was being described the same way from every direction at once. The supervisor exhaled slowly. It could be panic contagion, he said, though his tone didn't fully believe it. People repeating what they hear. The dispatcher shook her head slightly. It's not just repetition, she said. It's identical phrasing. Every time. She highlighted 3 separate calls on her screen. Same wording, same structure, same timing of delivery. Even the pauses before the key sentence matched too closely to be casual speech. The supervisor looked down at the pattern again, and then up at her. That's when he said it. That pattern would become the first clue investigators couldn't explain. The first patrol unit reached the outskirts address within minutes. No lights inside the house. No visible movement. The front door was already slightly open. No signs of forced entry, just a clean gap. Too neat to suggest struggle, too precise to suggest coincidence. The lead officer raised a hand before stepping in. Radio stays live, he said. They moved inside slowly. The house was unusually quiet. Not empty quiet. Controlled quiet. Like sound had been reduced rather than absent. A faint glow flickered from the living room. The television was still on, static looping across the screen in a steady, repeating pattern. No input, no channel. Just noise repeating itself without change. The officer tilted his head slightly. TV's still running, he muttered. but no one's here. At that exact moment, dispatch transmission cut through his earpiece. Units confirmed status. He paused. Because the dispatcher wasn't finishing the sentence. She was reacting to something on her screen. Officer, be advised, 911 calls are still coming in from that location. A beat. Then, but the 911 calls were still coming in from inside the house. The officer looked around the room again. Slowly. More carefully now. And realized something that didn't fit the situation at all. And the house was calling them back. They moved into the kitchen next. Clean counters. No signs of struggle, just normal household stillness interrupted mid-use. Then one officer noticed it. A phone, placed flat on the counter. Screen lit. Active call still connected to dispatch. The second officer leaned in slightly. "It's still live," he said. But no voice came through the speaker. Only silence. Not disconnected silence. Open line silence. The kind that meant something was still on the other end, but not speaking. The dispatcher's voice came through the radio again, sharper now. "We still have a live feed from that phone. Can you confirm anyone is present?" The officer picked up the device carefully. The call timer was still running, but the audio wasn't clean. A faint repetition was embedded underneath the line. A broken fragment of speech, the same structure they had been hearing all day. Just partial now, distorted, looping underneath itself like it had been played too many times. The officer frowned. "There's something on the line," he said quietly, "but it's not speaking normally." The dispatcher leaned closer to her screen. Her system was still receiving data from that device. Still routing audio through it, even without input. She started to respond, but stopped mid-sentence, because the waveform shifted again, and the repetition became clearer. Not from the dispatcher, not from the officer, but from the phone itself. And then came the realization forming across both ends of the line at once. The voice wasn't coming from the phone speaker alone. Outside, additional units were arriving. Neighbors had already been questioned informally by arriving officers. What they described didn't align cleanly. One neighbor insisted they heard a voice repeating the same sentence early in the morning. Another claimed it happened just before police arrived. A third said it happened minutes ago. Same voice, same sentence, exact repetition. But the timestamps didn't match, not even close. The reports overlapped in ways that defied normal sequencing. One witness described hearing it while another claimed silence at the exact same time window. The lead officer narrowed his eyes as he reviewed notes. "This can't all be happening simultaneously," he said. But the contradiction held. Same phrase, different moments. Impossible overlap. Then the radio crackled. Dispatch voice came through again, but it wasn't steady anymore. It carried interference that didn't match the environment. "We're showing conflicting call origins," the dispatcher said. "Same audio signature, different timestamps." A pause, then more urgent. That's when the officer requested backup, but the radio response never came. Static. A long break in transmission. And inside the house, movement began to split the team apart. The officer separated to check rooms. One moved upstairs, another stayed near the hallway. Radio contact remained open, but unstable. Then the upstairs officer paused. "Do you hear that?" he asked. No reply came immediately, only interference. Then a faint repetition slipped into the channel again. The same sentence fragment, returning but stronger now, not from one device, from multiple feeds at once. Like the house was feeding the phrase into every communication line simultaneously. The dispatcher heard it too, even through the distortion. Her grip tightened on her console. "Report status," she said. No response from upstairs. The hallway officer stepped forward. "Unit upstairs, confirm status." Silence. Then body cam feed flickered. Just briefly. A distortion in audio first, then visual instability. Enough to suggest movement had been interrupted. The dispatcher screen showed waveform spikes growing in intensity. The repeated phrase increasing in volume with every loop. Not new words, the same ones, returning faster each cycle. Then, the audio cut mid-sentence, not from disconnection, from interruption. The line from inside the house went silent mid-sentence. The team regrouped after the communication drop. The house, previously mapped as a standard residential structure, no longer matched the internal layout they were experiencing. Room counts didn't align. Hallway depth felt longer than expected. And then one officer stopped near the back corridor. He noticed something off about the wall seam. Too clean. Too new compared to the rest of the structure. He tapped it lightly. A hollow sound answered back. "Here," he said. They checked the floor plan again through dispatch. Nothing. No basement, no sublevel, no structural extension. But the sound didn't agree with the record. After a brief search along the baseboards, they found it. A concealed latch, hidden beneath a loose panel. Not forced, not damaged, just unused. The door opened slightly before they even fully engaged it. No resistance, just a soft release. Below them, a basement that should not exist. They descended cautiously. The air changed immediately. Drier, heavier, less like a room and more like a contained space. Walls lined with material not consistent with residential construction. Sound-dampening layers covered nearly every surface. Foam panels, fabric insulation, layered intentionally. Not for comfort, for isolation. One officer swept his flashlight across the room, then stopped. Equipment remnants were scattered across the floor. Old recording devices, wired setups, cables still partially connected to unseen ports. The setup wasn't recent, but it wasn't abandoned either. It had been used repeatedly. The dispatcher's voice came through faintly over radio. "Units, confirm location of source." The officer didn't answer immediately. That's because the audio feed in his earpiece began to distort again. But this time, differently. Not repetition, creation. A looping sound pattern forming from fragments of their own communication. The officer stepped closer to one of the devices. It was still powered. But the screen wasn't displaying playback. It was displaying output activity, new waveform generation, real-time synthesis. He frowned. "This isn't playback," he said slowly. He looked at the others. "They're not replaying recordings." A pause. The audio distortion in the radio intensified slightly, as if reacting to proximity. The officer finished the thought. But the recordings weren't playing audio. They were generating it. Back at dispatch, analysts were now reviewing every 911 call tied to the incident. Dozens of entries, different callers, different timestamps. But one detail refused to separate cleanly. The phrase, "a voice repeating inside the house?" It appeared in every call. Not similar phrasing, exact replication, even across different hours, even across different entry logs. A technician leaned over the playback system. "This shouldn't be possible," he said. Audio signatures are identical across separate recordings. The supervisor narrowed his eyes. Are you saying they're copied? The technician hesitated, then nodded once. They pulled multiple calls side by side. Different origins, different timestamps. But when aligned, the audio waveforms matched perfectly. Not just the phrase, the timing, the pauses, even background noise fluctuations. Everything synchronized. One investigator leaned back slowly. These aren't separate incidents, he said quietly. Another looked at him. Now, what are they then? A long silence followed. Then the conclusion formed slowly across the room. The investigator finally said it. The calls are not separate. They are copies. No one responded immediately, because that implied something none of the systems accounted for. If they were copies, there had to be an original. And then the lead analyst looked up from the screen, expression tightening, because another realization was forming underneath the first, lower, heavier, unsettling in its simplicity. Then they realized something even worse. The calls weren't coming from people. Inside the basement, radio contact became unstable again. The officer at the rear stepped closer to a mounted device, still faintly powered. Static rose in his earpiece. Then clarity returned for half a second. Too clean, too precise. And his own voice came through the line. Not spoken, replayed, but slightly delayed. I hear myself on the line. He stopped. Do you copy? Another officer asked from above. No answer came immediately. The repetition increased again. Faster now, layered. Not overlapping randomly, but building structure. As if the system was refining the phrase each time it repeated. The officer frowned, adjusting his earpiece. I said I hear... Static cut him off. The second half of the sentence never transmitted. The line degraded mid-phrase. Back at dispatch, the radio channel indicators began dropping one by one. Backup units attempting contact, failing. Signal loss cascading across multiple frequencies. One operator called out, "We're losing all outbound communication to the unit." Another channel opened briefly. Then a distorted voice came through. Unclear at first, then recognizable. The officer's voice, calm, too calm. I hear myself on the line. Then silence. Not static, not interference, just complete absence of response. The dispatcher leaned forward. Unit confirmed status, she said sharply. No reply. The channel remained open, but empty. And then, nothing. And then he stopped responding entirely. The investigation team didn't speak much during the reanalysis. Something about the data no longer felt like multiple incidents stitched together. It felt centralized, controlled, as if everything they had collected, every call, every report, every timestamp, was pointing back toward a single origin point they had been misunderstanding from the start. The analyst pulled up the full archive again, not separating by caller anymore, but by signal behavior. That changed everything. And because once the audio was stripped of caller identity, the differences disappeared. What remained was one continuous pattern, one repeating structure, one identical sequence of sound fragments that had simply been distributed across different moments, different voices, different locations. A technician leaned forward slowly. This isn't multiple people reporting the same thing, he said. No one corrected him, because the data no longer supported that idea. The waveform clusters aligned too cleanly now, too perfectly. like variations of the same recording played back through different channels with slight delays introduced each time. The supervisor stared at the screen longer than anyone else, then said it plainly. "We assumed this was a network of callers." A pause. Then, "But it's not." The room didn't interrupt him. And because everyone already understood where it was going, he continued, "It's a single repeating signal source." That sentence changed the room's temperature instantly, because it meant the calls were never independent, never separate, never real-time responses from different people. They were fragments of one continuous event being reflected across multiple endpoints. The analyst zoomed in on the earliest call logs again. The first report, then the second, then all the rest. And when layered together, not by time, but by pattern, the structure became obvious. Every call was structurally identical. Same opening instability, same escalation point, same final phrase. The differences weren't in content. They were in delay. The supervisor leaned closer to the screen, slowly speaking what the data was forcing them to accept. 911 calls were not reports. A pause. Then, they were echo loops of one event. No one responded, because the implication was already forming on every monitor at once. The system hadn't been collecting separate testimonies. It had been receiving repeated fragments of a single incident that kept re-entering the communication network in altered timing. The technician finally spoke again, quieter this time. So every caller he stopped, rechecked the logs, then finished. "Wasn't witnessing it separately." Silence followed. Then the supervisor corrected him without looking away from the screen. Every call was the same moment and replaying itself differently each time. The realization didn't land like a conclusion. It landed like something collapsing into place, because suddenly, how every previous assumption changed meaning. The calls weren't spreading information. They were reconstructing it, not describing what happened, reproducing it, across different channels, across different time stamps, as if the system itself had been looping a single event through multiple interpretations until it stabilized into consistency. The analyst leaned back slightly, and that's when the final shift became unavoidable. Because if all the calls were one event repeating, then the investigation logs weren't outside that system. They were inside it. The supervisor looked at the screen again, slowly, more carefully than before, and said what no one had fully accepted until that moment. The investigation itself is inside the loop. The room stayed still. Because nothing about the data suggested they were observing something from the outside anymore. Every recording, every timestamp, every analysis layer, it all carried the same repeating structure they had been studying from the beginning. The same phrase, the same timing, the same return pattern. And now it was no longer just evidence. It was participation. The analyst lowered his voice. "If the calls are looping, then what are we hearing when we listen to them?" No one answered immediately, because the system didn't feel like it was being analyzed anymore. It felt like it was responding to them. The archive room had gone unusually quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from lack of activity, but the kind that follows the moment everyone stops trusting what they're looking at. The technician reopened the earliest recovered transmission, the original officer's body cam-linked radio feed. It played back normally at first, clear, stable. Then the familiar distortion entered again underneath the audio. That same repeating phrase, subtle at first, then more structured. A voice repeating inside the house. The supervisor leaned in closer. "Focus on the timestamp," he said. The technician zoomed in, paused, then adjusted again. A slow realization began forming in his expression. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly. The supervisor didn't look away from the screen. "Read it." The technician swallowed, then said it. "The transmission never ended." Silence hit the room, because that changed everything they thought they had concluded. If the transmission never ended, then it wasn't a closed incident. And it wasn't archived. It wasn't past tense. The original officer's line hadn't disconnected. It had continued. Still open, still active, still carrying signal. The supervisor straightened slowly. "You're saying the call is still live?" No one answered immediately, because the system was already answering for them. Another incoming feed appeared on the screen. No caller ID, no origin mapping, just routing. Directly linked to the same location, the house. The analyst spoke quietly. "We're still receiving live calls from that house?" A pause, then softer. "In real time?" The implication spread through the room without needing explanation. The calls they had been studying weren't historical recordings. They were ongoing transmissions. Still active. Still looping. Still generating new instances of the same event. The technician pulled up the full archive again. But now the timestamps no longer felt sequential. They felt stacked, layered. Like the same moment being replayed with slight variations across an unbroken connection. The supervisor stepped back from the screen. Slowly. As if distance could correct what they were realizing. But it didn't. Because the system didn't stop. New call entries still appeared. Intermittent, irregular, but identical in structure. Each one carrying the same phrase, each one tied back to the same source. No physical caller could be identified. No network origin outside the house remained stable. Just repetition. The analyst whispered, "It's still happening." No one corrected him, because the data confirmed it. The loop hadn't resolved. It hadn't closed. It hadn't even slowed. It was continuing. Uninterrupted, and across systems that believed it had already ended. The supervisor looked at the archive log one final time, then said it plainly. "Some cases don't end. They just keep repeating." For a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. Even the system noise seemed to thin out. Then, a faint audio fragment slipped through the speaker system, barely audible. Not new, not different, just familiar enough to recognize immediately. The same repeating phrase, fading in, then stabilizing, as if it had always been there. The technician turned slowly toward the screen, but before anyone could respond, the feed cut to black. No error message, no disconnect alert, just absence. And in that silence, the final question remained on the screen longer than anything else had. If no one is there, who is still calling? If you're still here, this is exactly the kind of case this channel uncovers. Real 911 calls, unexplained investigations, and cases that never fully make sense. If you want more real-time reconstructions like this, make sure you subscribe, because some of these cases don't stay closed.